Again, I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar this evening. The title of our webinar is The Journey from Stigma to Healing. This is the third part of our four-part series for our BPD month educational, BPD Fest educational workshops. We're delighted that you can join us today. Again, my name is Paula Tusiani-Eng, and I'm here from the staff. While we do introductions and go over some introductory material, we invite you to write in the chat where you're coming from today. If you can just give us a shout out and let us know where you're coming from around the country. We welcome you. If you're joining us for the first time, it's nice to meet you. And if you've been here before, it's great to see you again. A little bit about Emotions Matter. Emotions Matter is a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded in 2015 to support, educate, and advocate for people impacted by borderline personality disorder. We do that through peer support programs, educational workshops such as this, art shows, and more. For more information about Emotions Matter, we invite you to go to our website at www.emotionsmatterbpd.org. Our mission is, again, to support, educate, and advocate for people with BPD. And our vision is to create a world in which every person with BPD has access to treatment and resources to achieve a meaningful recovery. We'll have more information at the end of the webinar about how you can get involved with Emotions Matter. We'd like to start off our series by acknowledging our sponsors who make programs like this possible: New York Presbyterian Hospital, the Francesco and Mary Giambelli Foundation, Karen Lerner Family Foundation, the Fishman Family Foundation, Mass General Brigham McLean Hospital, Silver Hill Hospital, the Kolbe Family Fund, Boehringer Engelheim, Eastern Services, the New England Personality Disorders Association, DBT Works, and the NEA BPD. Our programs and services are made possible by the generosity of our donors and sponsors, and we certainly appreciate them. And just a little bit about our webinar structure. Our webinar is 1 hour this evening. We'll have a few moments of introductions, and then we will have a panel discussion. And we'll follow with Q&A at the end. And I'm going to turn it over now to Sarah for more information.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So Emotions Matters philosophy, we strive to create a safe, judgment-free space for people with borderline personality disorder. We accept that there's a spectrum of experiences within the BPD community. We honor where people are on the journey without judgment or assumptions. We encourage people to define their own path towards recovery. We speak as experts of our own lived experience, not as medical experts. Professionals on our BPD Fest panels are volunteers speaking for educational purposes. We have some guidelines for community engagement. So questions during sessions should be asked using the Q&A box, not the chat. Comments can be made in the chat box. Use respectful language in the session chat. Any inappropriate messaging, including harassment, bullying, or monopolizing the chat, will be deleted. We accept difference and promote acceptance, especially with regard to gender, sexual orientation, identity, race, ethnicity, age, religion, disability, or politics. Avoid explicit expressions of self-harm or trauma, which may be upsetting to others. Panels and plenary sessions, this webinar will be recorded and available after the conference. No screenshots or recording on personal devices. We have some guidelines and a disclaimer. If at any time during BPD Fest 2025, you find yourself overwhelmed, struggling, or for any reason in need of support, we encourage you to reach out to your support system. Audience members may experience intense and painful emotions, feelings, memories, thoughts, and/or reactions to content shared. Participate at your own risk. You are also welcome to take a break from BPD Fest 2025 at any time or withdraw from it entirely. In the event of a medical, including mental health emergency, please seek care through a doctor, hospital, or emergency call number, such as 988 or 911 in the United States immediately. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our wonderful panelists. So first we have Dr. Sarah Masland, is a clinical psychologist and associate professor at Pomona College in Claremont, California. She co-chairs an international research committee focused on expanding access to good psychiatric management for BPD and leads a research lab dedicated to understanding and mitigating stigma. She's a previous member of the Emotions Matter board, and she currently serves on the board for the North American Society for the Study of Personality Disorders. She earned her PhD at Harvard University and completed her postdoctoral fellowship at McLean Hospital. Thank you, Dr. Maslin, for being here. We also have Alex Kehoe. Alex is a school social worker from Long Island, New York, and was diagnosed with BPD at the age of 12. His hope for this webinar is to share a bit about how the stigma around BPD has impacted the way he views himself and the world, and the ways he has learned to overcome this stigma as a professional in the mental health field. Thank you, Alex, for being here. Morgan Sweeney is a second-year medical student and incoming vice president of the Psych Sign chapter at Lincoln Memorial University DeBuss College of Osteopathic Medicine. She volunteers on the Emotions Matter Education Committee, drawing from her lived experience with BPD and a background in research and leadership to advocate for others. Morgan is passionate about redefining recovery from BPD and raising awareness about the possibility of living a fulfilling, meaningful life beyond diagnosis. Thanks, Morgan. And we have Victoria Fouch. She is an advocate for the destigmatization of BPD after facing differential treatment due to her diagnosis. She's passionate about sharing her story of stigma to bring awareness to the discrimination that people with BPD face, not only from society, but also from mental health professionals. Thank you all for being here. And we're going to start off with our panel. I'm going to ask some questions and go around to our panelists. We're going to get started. The first question, we just want you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your BPD journey, like when were you diagnosed, what symptoms you struggled with, and how it affected you. Morgan, you can start us off.
Okay, thank you so much for having me on the panel. I'm really excited to talk to everyone today. So my name is Morgan. I am someone with lived experience with BPD, as well as a deep interest in mental health from both a personal and a professional perspective. I first came across BPD when I was 16 years old. I wasn't diagnosed at that time, but when I read about the disorder, I immediately saw myself in it, and it explained so much of what I had been struggling with. Still, it took another 5 years and several missed diagnoses before I was formally diagnosed with BPD at 21. In some ways, finally hearing BPD from a clinician was actually a relief. It gave me a language for what I had been experiencing and a direction to begin healing. My presentation was pretty textbook. I'm at 8 out of 9 diagnostic criteria. I dealt with intense emotional instability, rapid mood shifts, chronic fear of abandonment, and a lot of difficulty in maintaining my relationships. And my self-worth was very fragile, and I felt a lot of emptiness and shame. I also dealt with self-harm and suicidal ideations. I felt like I was pretty much walking a tightrope emotionally. I'm constantly reacting, trying to keep myself from falling apart. After finally getting the diagnosis, though, I was able to start working on myself in a much more targeted way. One of the biggest challenges that I found was finding clinicians who truly understood BPD. Eventually, I found mentalization-based therapy program at McLean Hospital, which was really life-changing for me. Helped me develop a clear sense of myself and others, and I was taught how to slow down my reactions and be more reflective. And that program, along with my own internal drive, especially motivation that came from my academic goals and becoming a mother, set me on a steady path towards healing. Today, I can say that I've been in recovery from BPD for over 7 years. I no longer meet the diagnostic criteria, and I feel deeply stable in a way that I couldn't even have imagined at the time. I now live in Tennessee with my 7-year-old twin daughters, and I'm about to start my second year of medical school. My journey with BPD is a big part of what led me to pursue medicine, and I plan to specialize in psychiatry, hopefully with a focus on personality disorders and psychedelic science. I'm really grateful to be here today, have a chance to share my story, talk about stigma, which is a huge issue today, and help shift the conversation around what recovery can look like with BPD. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Morgan. Thank you so much for getting us started on this. At this time, I want to introduce Dr. Sarah Masland, and she can give us a little bit of more of a clinical overview about stigma.
Just going to share my screen here. I do have some slides. So I will try to keep this brief because I think one of the main things about stigma is that it's really important that we are really centering the voices of people with lived experience. And that's one of the things that I really most value about Emotions Matter is how focused it is on the experience from the perspective of folks with lived experience. So just to give you a sense of what I'll talk about today briefly, just a little bit about understanding stigma as it relates to BPD. I'll talk a little bit about my position here and history in this area, as well as why BPD is stigmatized and why it is stigmatized in many cases more than other forms of psychopathology or other diagnoses. I'll also talk about levels of stigma or areas where we might think about stigma, including self-stigma. So my position here, I want to be clear, is that I'm a clinician, I'm a researcher, and I'm a teacher. And I don't have the lived experience of BPD. And I think it's really important that I frame that as I begin this discussion, because one of the things I think that has really actually helped with destigmatization in recent years has been that there's been more and more inclusion of people with lived experience in research processes, in webinars like this one, in the development of curricular materials for educational programs. And so I want to be clear about my position coming into this. I do care very passionately about this. I encountered stigma about BPD when I was in my graduate training at Harvard, and I was really fortunate to have clinical placements as part of my clinical training at McLean Hospital, where I got to learn about BPD from people who really care about improving access to care and improving the quality of care for folks with BPD. But I have encountered stigma about the disorder in lots of spheres, and it's always really ground my gears in a way. And so that's why I dedicate much of my research and teaching to stigma about BPD. And this is a paper that I wrote a few years back with some colleagues, including, there's lived experience also represented in the author list here. And this was a call to action for actually destigmatizing BPD within science, within our research practices. So why is BPD stigmatized? There are multiple influences here. There's historical issues that are at play, and those historical issues, many of which persist and actually influence current issues with research, practice, and training. There's also problematic examples in media and other spheres that end up serving as stereotypes that drive attitudes about BPD. And then there's actually aspects of the disorder, I think, that are particular to BPD that are particularly misunderstood and that make the stigma of BPD different in quality and quantity from the stigma of other disorders. So first I'll talk about historical issues. And many of you may know that the history of the term borderline is an interesting one. Many people don't know what the term actually means, but it originally connoted this idea that the psychopathology existed at the border of psychosis and neurosis. And that's not really how we understand BPD today. But that understanding is pretty opaque, actually. It's hard to understand. And I think it's actually the first origin, the first seed of misunderstanding of BPD actually came from the name. The term was originally used pejoratively to label people who were considered quote unquote difficult to treat. And many of those were women, the majority of whom were women in the early days. The diagnosis was first articulated formally in 1980 in the DSM-3, and research seriously skyrocketed after it was articulated in the DSM. Say what you will about the DSM, I have a love-hate relationship with it for sure, but it definitely influences what we're studying. And research really increased for BPD, but still it was relegated to what was called Axis 2, so personality disorders, until DSM-5, which came out in 2013. were relegated to access to, which was background conditions that were considered not treatable, that were considered kind of background to the conditions for which you would seek treatment, like depression or generalized anxiety disorder. And so that relegation kind of cemented this idea that BPD wasn't treatable, which we know is wrong. So these historical issues persist today in ways that actually drive current issues with research and practice and training. So we have significant disparities still in research funding on BPD compared to similar conditions. There's definitely fewer dollars being spent in this area. There's also lingering pejorative, wrong, and otherwise problematic attitudes in training programs. This is something that I encounter a lot. I don't have a slide enumerating the ways that BPD is stigmatized, but I know that, and this is something that the panelists will all speak to, that stigma from clinicians is a big problem, and this often results from issues in training programs. Earliest educational exposures, even to undergraduate students, I think about this a lot as a professor at a liberal arts college, are often marked by stigma, often stereotypes or poor media portrayals are presented in these early educational exposures. And then there's a lack of training, even in doctoral programs. I am currently working on a publication with some colleagues where we surveyed 345 APA accredited doctoral training programs in psychology in the United States. And it turns out that only 29% of people graduating with PhDs in psychology are getting trained in personality disorders, compared to 90% of trainees from those similar programs who get trained to treat depressive disorders. So there's huge disparities in the training programs. And then there's significant research limitations, as that paper I wrote outlines. The way that we talk about BPD in research really needs to improve in many ways, and we need to continue to include people with lived experience in research. So there's also problematic examples in media and other spheres. I won't go into this in great detail, but I'm sure you could all conjure an image of someone with BPD in a television show or a movie that's really problematic. There's also aspects of the disorder that kind of are associated with misunderstanding. In general, personality disorders, including other PDs, are more poorly understood than other disorders. And I think this is in part because we know from basic psychology that humans use heuristics and quick judgments to understand complex behaviors. And the behaviors in BPD are oftentimes really concerning and alarming. We think, for example, about impulsivity, if we think about non-suicidal self-injury or suicidal behaviors, these are very complex behaviors, and oftentimes people don't have the tools to really understand the motivations or the things that drive those behaviors. I just want to say briefly that stigma exists at multiple levels, and I think our panelists will speak to this. There's the stigma from the public. This includes from family members. This includes from clinicians. That contributes to poor outcomes. And we often think about stigma in that area, but what often gets neglected is that there's stigma embedded in legislation and policy. In insurance provisions, for example, stigma might be embedded. In legal systems, stigma might be embedded. You may be aware that Emotions Matter worked really hard with some other organizations back in 2023 to change a law in California that made people with BPD eligible for prison diversion programs, to actually change that structural stigma. And then there's self-stigma, which I think often does get neglected in these conversations, but I've already heard it come up on the panel, and I'm sure other folks will talk about it. This other model kind of expands this to consider that we also need to be thinking about intersectional characteristics. So aspects of identity that are going to intersect with the BPD diagnosis are really important as well. So very briefly, framework for self-stigma, because I know it will be talked about. Public stigma definitely drives self-stigma. When we're aware of stigmatizing attitudes in the public, they're hard to escape, so awareness is easy to come by. We sometimes internalize those. We start to agree with those negative attitudes, and then we might actually apply them to ourselves, which results in self-stigma. And the real tragedy of self-stigma is that it creates a self-sustaining or self-fulfilling prophecy, whereby when you have self-stigma, you fail to, or you stop kind of striving towards important goals that can then kind of further entrench a negative sense of self, and that lead to further problems with the symptoms of BPD. So moving forward, I won't say too much about this, but I will just say there are many points of intervention for stigma. There's lots of people doing work to destigmatize BPD. And of course, the locus of intervention is going to depend on what type of stigma you're addressing. There's also evidence to suggest, kind of hopefully, that the stigma of BPD is decreasing over the past decade. So that's really exciting. And then I really like this phrase at the bottom. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Latin, but the idea is nothing about me without me. And we're seeing more and more again that lived experience is becoming a real part of the push to destigmatize BPD. And that's part of why we're starting to make such important progress in that area. And so more of that will be fantastic. So that's all I have to say for now. I'm happy to answer questions. I hope this helps kind of frame some of the discussion, particularly this idea that stigma exists in these multiple spheres, public, structural, and self-stigma, and those are all going to interact in really important ways. And I'm excited to hear from the panelists. And stop share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Maslin. Thank you for sharing all that with us. Now I'm going to turn it over to Alex. If you would like to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your BPD journey, when you were diagnosed, what symptoms you struggled with, and how it affected you.
Definitely. So my name's Alex. I use he, him pronouns. I am currently a licensed master social worker from Long Island, New York. I work in a middle school doing social work. I graduated with my master's in social work from Stony Brook University in 2023. And I'm also a transgender male. Kind of give like some context of the multiple struggles I've been through aside from BPD and with BPD. So I was first diagnosed with BPD when I was about 12 years old. I think I was in 6th or 7th grade in middle school. And at first I really I got the diagnosis. My parents knew, but we never really pursued it further. I think because we knew the stigma that is associated with not just BPD, but personality disorders in general. Like Dr. Maslin was saying. So at first I really didn't acknowledge it at all. I pushed it away. I did not associate with it. Um, and I was embarrassed. So I never told anyone about it until I was 25 years old. And now I'm turning 27 this year, so very recently. So I believe it was at the beginning of last year, I started to realize that like my chronic depression, these intense suicidal ideations that were coming and going in waves all the time, just feeling empty, not knowing who I am, always feeling like I had to be in a romantic relationship to love myself, not really knowing how to do that by myself. I started to realize that these patterns were directly related to the BPD diagnosis. And I think that I was feeling so misunderstood because I was in and out of therapy since receiving that diagnosis at 12, and none of my therapists were versed in treating BPD or really knew how to treat BPD. So it wasn't until I sought out DBT therapy actually, and I got a therapist that also had lived experience with BPD, and I started to really realize that, you know, even though this is a part of who I am, it doesn't mean that I can never change. Because I always felt like because I had this label of a personality disorder, that this is just who I am and I have a defect in my personality. And it felt hopeless, really hopeless. But going through therapy and also finding emotions matter, it kind of made me realize that there is hope and that just because you're living with this type of diagnosis, it doesn't mean that you're not deserving of living, a full and fulfilling life. And I realized that recovery was possible. So, I'm still in my journey of recovery and trying to continue going to therapy and learning how to cope with these symptoms of BPD. But that's just kind of a little bit about my journey so far.
Wow, thank you so much, Alex. Really appreciate that. And I'm going to turn it over to Victoria if you'd like to introduce yourself. Tell us about your BPD journey.
Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria. I thank you for coming out tonight and listening to our stories. I'm 22 years old and I currently reside in Wilmington, North Carolina, but I soon will be relocating to Knoxville, Tennessee as a law school student. June will mark 2 years since I was diagnosed with BPD. I had struggled with very intense emotions and fear of abandonment. My interpersonal relationships really struggled because of that. And I dealt with really bad disassociation and suicidal ideation. I really struggled with basing my self image and worth off of how others were treating me. Even if it was someone looking at me the wrong way, it really affected my well being. Um, these symptoms were an everyday thing, and it became extremely exhausting juggling my education and my workload, as well as feeling all of these things. So, when I finally did seek psychiatric treatment, um, and their opinion, it was really a huge relief that I got diagnosed with this because it allowed me to understand why my treatment was not working. Um, I didn't have the financial support, so I enrolled myself in therapy at 17 years old, and my therapist had thought I had bipolar disorder. She was not very well versed in BPD, and so it was when it wasn't working, and she suggested to go the medicine route. Um, I sought out a psychiatrist, and that's when the BPD was mentioned to me, and I was diagnosed with that. And so it was a huge relief to me because it allowed me to understand why the things that I was trying were not working. And also, I checked off all the boxes and I finally found something that related to me. It was so refreshing, finding something that, you look up the symptoms and it was everything that I felt. And it was something that my therapist had thought I had bipolar, and it just never clicked. And I still felt like, I struggled with a very different aspect of things when it came to bipolar and BPD. So I'm very passionate about mental health, and I'm glad I found Emotions Matter. I'll talk about it a little later, but stigma is what led me to finding Emotions Matter, and they have been an extremely big help in my journey to BPD.
Thank you so much, Victoria. We're so glad that you found us and that you're a part of our family. Um, for the next question, I'm going to go around the room again. BPD is often associated with stigmatized language or views. Have you experienced any stigma? If so, what kind or how? And how did it affect your journey towards recovery? Morgan, go ahead.
Yes, so unfortunately, I have experienced a lot of stigma around BPD in many forms, and it's something that definitely has left a pretty deep impact on me. Even today, when I'm not struggling with the same symptoms I was before, that's definitely something that's stuck with me. One of the earliest moments I can remember was during an inpatient hospitalization. I believe I was 18 at the time. A clinician told me that I had almost all of the symptoms of BPD, but that she would never diagnose someone with that because it was too stigmatized, and that once it was in my chart, I'd be treated differently. And she was right in a way, but not in the way that she meant. And by avoiding the diagnosis, she also delayed my access to the kind of targeted treatment that ultimately helped me to recover. Outside of the clinical settings, stigma can be even more aggressive and blunt. I'm sure all of us have seen some pretty truly horrible things written about people with BPD in the online space. I've also experienced a more subtle but equally painful form of stigma. When I used to attend support groups and home meetings in New England, I often connected with parents or loved ones of individuals with BPD. After speaking with me, they'd sometimes say things like, "You're so articulate, you seem so self-aware, you're not at all what I expect from someone with BPD." These comments were well-meaning, but they revealed the low expectations and really harmful assumptions that people often carry about people with this disorder. Now, as someone who's on the path to becoming a physician, I think a lot about how stigma functions, not just interpersonally, but within healthcare as well. Although I no longer meet the criteria for BPD, it's still a part of my personal and my medical history. And that history does make me nervous. Many states still ask physicians very invasive questions about mental health treatment, including past conditions that may no longer be clinically relevant. And the reality is that many doctors choose to suffer in silence rather than risk disclosure. As a result, physicians continue to have some of the highest suicide rates of any profession. I definitely don't have all the answers, but I know that part of the solution for me personally has to be openness and visibility. And that's why I've chosen not to hide my history with BPD, even as I move further into my professional role. I want to be someone that helps chip away at the stigma, and both for my future patients and for my colleagues. And no one should ever have to choose between seeking help and protecting their career. No diagnosis, including BPD or any other personality disorder, should define a person's potential or limit the care that they receive.
Thank you, Morgan. Wow. Really appreciate that. And I'm going to turn it over to Alex, if you can tell us about your experience in stigma and your journey towards recovery.
Definitely. So when I was becoming a social worker, I believed that all social workers had the same beliefs, the same values. They wanted to advocate for the same things. But going through my graduate program at Stony Brook, made me realize that that is not the case. We rarely ever talked about BPD, and if we did, it was how difficult they are to work with, like clients with BPD, not to work with them because they're so difficult and they're manipulative. People with personality disorders, there's no treatment for them because there's no medication. I would hear language like that. So throughout college, I never told anybody I had BPD. I felt inspired. There was one person in my program that did share that she was living with BPD, and she tried to educate, even professors that were talking about it in these ways. So that was tough going through the program like that, knowing I was struggling with BPD. It made me really not want to get help even more because I was like, I feel like this is just something I have to swallow. Um, and then similar to what Morgan was saying, scrolling through like online forums, I would be on Reddit, for where partners of people with BPD would be talking about their experiences, and they would talk about how impossible it is to be with somebody who has BPD, how volatile they are, how chaotic the relationship is, how emotionally unstable they are. And so it kind of was reinforcing in my head like all of the things I struggled with, and I started to believe that maybe I would never be able to have a healthy relationship or have these interpersonal relationships that I saw other people having. So the stigma really impacted my self-esteem and my I guess like my motivation to get help. Because there was such a prevalent assumption that people with BPD are untreatable. And I saw that in my program. And so even now in the field, I find myself experiencing other social workers talk about BPD in that way. And I want to get to a point where I'm able to kind of speak up and speak about my experience and really change the stigma that is out there.
Thank you, Alex. You're here doing just that, changing that. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And Victoria, we'll turn it over to you, if you can tell us about your experience with stigma on your journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll start this off by saying that when I got diagnosed, I found it really weird because my psychiatrist had asked me if I was okay with the diagnosis. And I thought that was very weird because I mean, you go to the doctor and they don't ask you if you have a broken foot, they tell you you have a broken foot. And she had said that it's a very stigmatized thing. And so most people do not want to be diagnosed with BPD. And I didn't really understand it. I kind of shrugged it off because I was passionate about mental health. And I experienced it for the first time last year. Um, I got a job as a case manager at a correctional facility, a state job that would have changed my life. It was the highest I would have ever been paid. And I was offered a conditional offer for it. And I had to go through a hiring process, a 5-week process. And in the end, there was a psychiatric evaluation. And so I was pretty confident because I had asked the person who hired me at first if being diagnosed with anything would kind of halt anything. And she said, no, if you're not diagnosed with anything, then I think you're crazy. And so I went ahead and proceeded with with the hiring process, and I got to my psych eval, and the psychiatrist was asking me very detailed questions regarding hypothetical situations in my past. And at the very end, she had asked me if I was diagnosed with anything, and I had told her I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And I thought that should be the lengthiest part of my interview, but it turned out to be the shortest. And she had asked me one other question other than that. And so, sensing, the silence in the room, I decided to ask her if that would affect my employment. Um, and she had told me, straight up, she had said it's a very high risk diagnosis and a big red flag for employment of this nature. Um, and she said that it did raise a red flag for her, but she didn't know how much the hiring board would place emphasis on her opinion, which I knew wasn't true because, if a psychiatrist tells you someone is not able to perform the duties of their jobs, you're not going to go through with hiring them. 2 days after this, I received a withdrawal letter of my conditional offer. And so I was, the job was taken away from me. And I'm now a case manager, but at a law firm because I didn't have to go through a psych eval. So I'm doing the same exact work, just in a different setting. Um, the day after, I had a therapy session, and I discussed this with my therapist, who originally thought that I had bipolar disorder. And I had told her, what I had told the psychiatrist. And she goes, "Oh, well, I don't really think you have borderline personality disorder," she said, "because I don't work very well with people with BPD, and they are generally in and out of psych wards, and I find them to be very manipulative, and I do not find you to be manipulative, and, I get along with you." And so I basically, was shut off after that because, I had a breakdown after getting my job um, retracted from me. And so then, literally 2 days after, I looked up advocacy for Emotions Matter because I decided that, it's not going to bring me down. And it sparked a fire in me. It made me very angry. Um, so it definitely affected me. I did not know it, but honestly, I'm grateful for it because I was so naive and young when I first got my diagnosis that I didn't really listen to the psychiatrist, telling me, "Hey, there's stigma." And I never experienced it like that before. So I'm truly appreciative of these because it led me here and it led me, to my career in law.
Wow, thank you so much, Victoria. That was so inspiring. I have chills listening to that. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. But I'm really glad that you're here at Emotions Matter. We're going to go on to the next question. What helped you in moving forward on your BPD wellness journey to overcome the stigma? So we're going to start off with Morgan.
One of the biggest things that helped me move forward and overcome stigma around BPD was learning how to be more intentional, both with how I share my story and with the people that I allow in my life. There's a lot of pressure, especially when you're in recovery or trying to be an advocate, to be completely open all the time. And while I deeply value honesty, I've also learned that being open doesn't mean oversharing. So I've worked to find a balance between vulnerability and discernment, sharing parts of my story when it's relevant. I'm not out of shame, but out of my choice. Another big piece of my healing was stepping away from defining myself solely by my diagnosis. And early on, BPD felt like it touched every part of who I was. And in some ways, that was valid at that time. But as I progressed in my recovery, I realized that in order to build a sustainable sense of wellness, I had to focus on constructing an identity that went beyond my mental health history. For me personally, that meant investing in things that gave me a sense of purpose and joy. So my role as a mother, my pursuit of a career in medicine, and simple things like traveling, spending time in nature, and going waterfall hunting with my daughters. Those kind of things remind me that I'm a full, complex person, not just someone with a specific diagnosis. I also became a lot more selective about who I allow in my inner circle. I used to spend a lot of energy trying to prove myself to people who didn't understand or who made judgments based on the label of BPD. But over time, I've learned to prioritize relationships that are built on mutual respect and compassion. People who would judge me for a diagnosis or who see mental health struggles as a weakness just simply don't have a seat at my table anymore. At the end of the day, overcoming stigma has been less about changing other people's perceptions, and it's been a lot more about changing the way that I see myself. And the more grounded that I have become in who I am, I built a life that aligned a lot more with my values, and the stigma now holds a lot less power over me.
Thank you so much, Morgan. Wow, really appreciate that. Alex.
Yeah, so honestly, to start, emotions matter. Like I can honestly say it did change my life because being in a group setting and hearing other people share their experiences with BPD, knowing I wasn't alone, knowing that these people had relationships and they were trying to be healthy and they were trying to get help and some of them were in recovery. So it gave me hope and it definitely made me realize that A, I wasn't alone and B, I'm not unlovable just because of this diagnosis. Um, I just had childhood trauma, that I didn't address, that I wasn't able to address until I realized that I went through it. Um, I started going to DBT therapy, like I said before, and that really helped because I was able to learn healthy ways to regulate my emotions, and also understand how BPD develops and how it functions. I think understanding that that it was in part like a result of the things I went through growing up. It helped me understand why I am the way I am and how these are kind of like trauma responses that have been built inside of me. So that definitely helped. Being surrounded by a community of people experiencing the things I was struggling with, allowed me to feel hope for my future for the first time. Um, I was able to understand that I wasn't too hard to love. I wasn't always gonna feel empty. I wasn't always going to not know who I am or not be able to love who I am. Um, that there's hope and that we are capable of change. Everybody, is capable of change and it's not hopeless for us. And nobody is alone, so emotions matter really, really helped, kind of change it for me.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Victoria.
So, experiencing the stigma for BPD, ironically, put me on the path to recovery. It allowed me to do a lot of self-reflection. I became extremely passionate about our community and how it affects others. So sharing my story, I've come to realize has helped me a lot, saying it out loud and, hearing people be supportive. So, I talk about it whenever I can, whether it's to a friend or, someone, because if you just generally mention BPD in a conversation, it becomes more normalized. Um, and so I think that that truly did help me, and hearing other people's stories, knowing that they shared similar struggles. Being in a healthier relationship has definitely helped me. I was not in a healthy relationship when I started to, have my downfall of BPD symptoms, but it has allowed me to have time and space to heal and develop healthy relationship habits because, I was not in a good place to have a relationship when I began to struggle the most. Um, and there's a reason that people with BPD thrive in nurturing jobs. There's a lot of studies on it. They thrive in employment where, they're caretakers and they take care of things. And it goes on to show that, we are very compassionate people. We're caring. And you really can't focus on the labels that people give you. You can't focus on, you're not manipulative. You just feel things very strongly, and that is completely okay. And there's a lot of beauty in that, in feeling things very strongly. And, I think that's the beauty of a BPD diagnosis. I know there's a lot of pain and struggle associated with it, but it does allow us to have this other lens in life. So I definitely say, being in a healthy relationship and being aware of the stigma and just, being in a BPD community, Emotions Matter provides peer support groups, which were recommended to me at first. I have not joined one yet, but I have seen how it affects other people and they seem to really like it. So, they offer a lot of resources to help with that. And then I have two ESA dogs who I love. they keep me busy, and it just, I don't know, it heals something in my heart having, them close, because a lot of people do really, suck, and you really can't put your self-worth on how they treat you, which is something that I feel like we probably all struggle with. I've had very toxic people in my life. I've had to remove myself from tables and jobs. There's a lot of toxicity in a lot of jobs. So really, you have to remove yourself from harmful situations. And that's the only way you can really start to heal, is because you can take a step back and look and say, oh, I wasn't the problem. Now I can focus on, my healing journey and, how to manage my symptoms better.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you so much. For our last question, what advice do you have for others in managing stigma? And what can we do as a BPD community about the stigma? I'm going to start off with Dr. Sarah Masland.
Sorry, I was you caught me off guard. I was responding to something in the chat.
Sorry.
So what can we do as a community to reduce BPD stigma? I think there are a great many things. I think that I obviously come at this from the perspective of research. I definitely think research helps. But I think actually one of the biggest things that we need to do is work on training programs. And I think that both Alex and Morgan spoke to really powerful experiences here where we need to make sure that in whether it's medical school programs, whether it's social work programs, that we are getting knowledge into the hands of the people who are training the next professionals. I think that the lingering negative stigma in amongst clinicians is probably the worst, like the thing that needs to be addressed the most. And there's people working on these efforts. I will say that I think progress in this area is always slow because there's so many programs that we need to be changing. But I think that I take a lot of hope from knowing that both Alex and Morgan have gone through these types of programs and are now actually the people providing care, right? Like they're doing the work of destigmatizing that I think is actually the most important. If we look at the science of stigma, we know that contact interventions are actually the most effective. Contact interventions are those which actually create contact between people with lived experience and people who don't have that lived experience, right? So sharing these stories, making it known, right? That like, people, like we all know people with BPD, right? And we all probably love someone with BPD, right? Making that kind of thing more known, I think, is one of the most powerful things that we can do.
Thank you so much. Morgan.
Yeah, so I'm going to address a similar aspect of this question, just in terms of what we can do as a community to combat stigma. And I think one of the most powerful things that we can do is just to keep showing up in public spaces, in professional settings, in conversations as our full complex selves. I think stigma thrives in silence. Every time one of us tells the truth about what BPD actually looks like, especially stories of recovery and strength, and moving through difficult times, we challenge the narrative that BPD is a life sentence, or something to be feared. We also need to make room at the same time for diversity of experiences within the community. Not everyone's path will look the same. Some people may still be in the thick of it, others may be years into recovery, and many will fall somewhere in between, but every single one of those stories matters. And so I do think that we also need to avoid turning recovery into a new expectation in a way that erases the struggle or make people feel like they're failing if they're not there yet. I think that we do have a unique opportunity and responsibility to push back against harmful narratives from within systems. So I do love to see so many people in here commenting about, some things that they want to do in their own career and their own personal lives in the chat. It's really powerful to read. So I think those are some really great ideas. And I think we just keep talking about it and keep pushing it. And it's better than it was 10 years ago. And in 10 years, it'll be better than it is now.
Wow, thank you so much. Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Morgan was saying. A lot of us suffer in silence, like we're scared to speak up because we don't want to be treated differently. We don't want to experience this stigma. So we swallow it, we push it down. Doing something like this, I never thought I would do something like this and be so open and especially as a mental health professional because that's where I was the most scared to be open because of the program that I went through and the lack of knowledge about BPD and the stigma. So my advice, is just don't be afraid to ask for help and tell your story. Try to seek out support from qualified professionals and don't be afraid to advocate for your needs. Or switch providers if you feel like you're not getting the appropriate support. Because I think, a lot of us can relate to being mistreated by professionals. And also, remind yourself that BPD, it's not a defect that we have. It makes us special because our ability to feel things intensely, to love people passionately, to experience empathy in the level that we do, um, it makes us unique. It sets us apart from everybody else. And being able to love like that, I think, is very special. Try to surround yourself with people that see you, that hear you, that love you for who you are, that don't expect you to change who you are. Um, and like Morgan said, recovery is not linear and it looks different for everybody. And just remember that you're not your diagnosis. We're so much more than a label that somebody gives us. And it is possible for us to get better and to work on ourselves.
Thank you so much, Alex. And Victoria, if you want to end us off with some advice for the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be quick with it because Morgan and Alex made some very good points. I will just say that, you know, in terms of managing stigma for, yourself, speak your truth. Don't be quiet. No matter how many times people push you down, continue to get back up. And even with all these stories of, discrimination in the professional field, if people continue to be diagnosed with BPD and show up in these spaces in these different fields, eventually they're just going to have to accept it. So I think showing up and, speaking your truth is very big. I know it can be uncomfortable at times because you're worried about being judged, but that's why emotions matter is here. And it's a beautiful thing to do. And also, I do know, managing stigma, I would definitely seek out professional help. I know that a lot of times that's where we run into stigma. But like Alex said, if it doesn't work out, continue, you can try something else. And I know that I'd like to mention this financially. Sometimes it is not doable to find good providers and be able to switch up because some insurances you can only use specific psychiatrists and everything. But there are a lot of other, if you do the research, there are a lot of other third party places to go to seek help. But definitely, get involved with the community and don't stop talking about it because if you stop talking about it, we'll go back in the shadows. But I think it's very powerful. And just you guys showing up here does a lot for it.
Thank you so much. Wow, this was super powerful. So amazing to have all of you here. It's so incredible. And I hope that you were able to see the comments in the chat. Everybody's so inspired. So this is absolutely fantastic. Thank you. We don't have a lot of time, but we do have some questions. Dr. Maslin, did you want to answer some of the questions or should I read them out loud for the whole group?
I've been answering some in the chat, like in the Q&A. I've been answering some just with text. And I can keep doing that, but I think there's one for Alex specifically in the Q&A, and maybe some others that the other panelists could speak to.
Great. I'll read the one for Alex. I'm a licensed mental health therapist who is navigating being recently diagnosed and reconciling that with my clinical identity. One of my personal experience themes is struggling to trust my judgment and instincts, and I'm noticing that impacting my professional identity as well. Alex, I know this is a nuanced question, but how do you hold space for and integrate these two parts of your identity? My hope is that my lived experience will feel like my biggest tool someday, but early in my journey, it feels daunting.
I relate to that 100%. It's hard to really know like where is a safe space to tell coworkers, supervisors, people you work with that you have BPD or lived experience with BPD. So it's really a case by case basis. Like you really have to feel safe with the people around you. But in your private, um, like when you're working with clients and you're on your own, and you're doing the work, you're inspiring other people that are struggling with the same things that you're struggling with. And you don't really have to hide that, because your ability to relate to your clients in that way is transformational for them. And so I've found that when I work with clients directly, like even if I'm not telling my coworkers that I have BPD or my supervisor that I have BPD, um, which honestly it helps us relate to our clients more. So I see it as a strength, but not everybody does. But when I do my work, I know that I'm not hiding that part of myself because I can help somebody who's afraid to come to terms with their diagnosis, or they're afraid that they're not going to receive appropriate treatment if they disclose some of the symptoms they're experiencing. So I think it's about having that balance, but remembering not to close off that part of you in your work.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. And again, nice comments in the chat. So that's wonderful to see. We have another question. If stigmas have kernels of truth, how do we become compassionate for others who may have had past experiences with others with BPD? There was somebody that wanted to answer that, I believe.
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
answer.
Perfect.
Give my perspective on this. So I think a big challenge for a lot of us who have or had a diagnosis of BPD is guilt, and there's kind of two sides to this. There are um, times when guilt is appropriate, and because we have acted in a way that doesn't represent our values, and then there are times when we feel guilty just for being who we are and like existing with a diagnosis that we don't want to have. So I think there's room to have empathy for others who have had difficult or painful experiences with someone with BPD or any other diagnosis for that matter. I think this applies really to any mental health diagnosis. But I think it's important for them and us to acknowledge that there's no diagnosis that makes someone act in a bad way, right? Like we are all making choices every moment and no one's perfect. Like I've done many things that I would consider bad in my life, and I've done probably more good things, but I just think it's important to like separate the action from the person or from the diagnosis. And yeah, so my advice there would be just give them the same empathy that you would give everyone else, and lend them an ear and hope that they understand too that the diagnosis wasn't the reason someone did that to them.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry if we haven't gotten to all the questions. You can also always email us, info@emotionsmatterbpd.org, and I'm going to turn it over to Paula to wrap it up for us. All right? Did you want to wrap it up? Okay. You're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you for that. I just want to thank our panelists for this amazing webinar tonight. We lead with our truth, and the truth will set you free. And I think the theme tonight is that, when we tell our stories, that is how we will we will move the needle. Every time we tell our stories, we are changing perceptions. And so I thank you for your vulnerability tonight and sharing. We just have a couple of closing announcements, and there'll be some links dropped in the chat. Our last webinar series is in 2 weeks from tonight on Wednesday, May 21st. It's on the journey to find community. And Brad, Oliver, Andre, and Clyde, who run our BPD and men's support group, are going to be talking about their unique journey as people that identify with the male experience of BPD, what it's been like to find community and healing on the journey to recovery. I think there were some questions about gender and BPD, and we believe it's really important to give voice to a variety of experiences because BPD is different for each person depending on, who you are and where you come from. And so that is 2 weeks from now. You'll get the link within 24 hours of the meeting if you're already registered for our series, and we hope you'll join us for this final webinar. Also, you will get a survey. It'll be in the link now, but you'll also get it tomorrow. If you've enjoyed our webinar series, we do invite you to please fill out our post-event survey. This is where we get ideas for next year's webinar series, and we do hold webinars throughout the year, seasonally, and we get the ideas from people that write on the survey. Hey, I'd really like to hear you guys do a panel on this. So we really do read the surveys, and we do appreciate your feedback. So our survey link is here. You'll get it again tomorrow. And then finally, we are so excited to be able to share with you that it is May. It is BPD Awareness Month. And our big fundraiser for the year is our BPD Walk. It is virtually. You can participate wherever you live. By walking in your community for Emotions Matter, or you can come down and join us in person on Sunday, June 1st at Pier 46 in New York City. This is our biggest fundraiser of the year, where we raise essential funds to be able to offer BPD peer support groups at no cost to our community. We help thousands of people a year in our BPD peer support groups that some people have mentioned here tonight. And we really believe that when you're struggling with BPD, it's imperative to meet other people so that you feel less alone and more connected to a community, and you feel less shameful and stigmatized, as a lot of people have talked about. Community matters. And so we don't want people, when we know how hard it is for people to pay for therapy, to have to pay for peer support. And so for us to offer peer support for free, we need to raise money. And so we do ask, if you're able to make a donation within your means, whether it's $5, $10, $25, whatever you can do, please join our Walk for BPD, make a donation, form a walk team, send it out to families and friends, because we believe our work is vitally important, and we want to be able to expand that work. And we can only do that if we can hit our fundraising goals. So check out the Walk for BPD. It'll also be live streamed on YouTube, so you can watch it and walk wherever you are. You can get your walk t-shirts, and we have a global community here at Emotions Matter. As you see, our panelists are from all over. And so we are creating a movement for change. And the more people that are walking in their community, you are our voices in your state and in your community. So you can go to GiveButter /C/BPD Walk 25 to register for our walk. And for more information, as always, you can check us out at www.emotionsmatterbpd.org. You can email us at info@emotionsmatterbpd.org, and we can connect you with more information about our programs and services. Again, thank you to our panelists, and have a great night. Thank you, Sarah, also for moderating our panel this evening. Have a good night, everyone.